It was a brisk Tuesday morning when Camille Johnson entered the courthouse, her footsteps echoing against the cold marble floors. She glanced at the rows of chairs filled with others waiting for their turn. The usual quiet hum of the building seemed to fade as her thoughts drifted back to the events that led her here today. She had never imagined finding herself in a courtroom again, not in this way, not like this. Camille had worked tirelessly to get to where she was today, a young woman who had climbed out of the hardships of her past and forged her own path. But today was different. She was not there to fight for something big, not for an important deal, or to make a name for herself. She was just there to face a traffic ticket. She never expected her past would catch up with her here. But as she walked up to the front of the room to stand before the judge, she realized she was wrong. Judge William Hawkins sat behind the large wooden desk, his posture perfect as he reviewed the cases in front of him. The courtroom around him was calm, no surprises here, a regular day filled with the usual small cases, speeding tickets, parking fines, and civil disputes, the kind of work that kept him busy but unchallenged for most of his career. Hawkins was the kind of judge who valued order and procedure above all else, and today was no different. He was ready to make quick decisions and move on, but when Camille stood before him and he glanced at her name, something unfamiliar stirred inside him. He read the file in front of him, not thinking much of it until he noticed her name, Camille Johnson. It seemed so familiar, but it didn't click at first. He looked up at her again, trying to place her face as she stood there poised and confident, as if she belonged in any room she entered, and suddenly it hit him. A memory from years ago flashed before his eyes, a younger Camille standing in the back of a crowded lecture hall, her eyes focused, sharp and determined, her voice cutting through a heated debate in law school. They had been rivals. Then he remembered the fierce competition, the late-night study sessions, the constant struggle to outdo one another. He had never thought about her since those college days. But now, seeing her standing before him, it felt as though time had collapsed and the past and present merged into one. Camille shifted nervously from one foot to the other. She didn't recognize him immediately, though something about his gaze unsettled her. She had faced many judges in her life, each one with their own level of warmth or indifference. But this one was different. She couldn't place it, but there was a tension between them, something unspoken hanging in the air, as if they were both navigating an invisible boundary between the past and the present. Camille had heard stories of judges making snap decisions based on their own biases or experiences, but she didn't expect it to happen to her today. Judge Hawkins cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but something in it suggested he was grappling with something more than just the case at hand. As he asked her to explain why she couldn't pay the fine right away, his mind was still racing back to that time at university, when Camille was the one who constantly challenged him for the top spot in everything from class discussions to internships and scholarships. They had been fierce competitors, but in that courtroom, it felt like the competition was far from over, even if neither of them fully realized it yet. As Camille stood there, her mind began to race back to the days when she first encountered William Hawkins, the days when she was just another ambitious law student trying to survive in a sea of privilege and connections. She had been fresh out of high school, a scholarship student from a working-class neighborhood, walking into a world that seemed both intimidating and out of reach. Her drive to succeed had been fueled by necessity, not choice. Camille had learned early that in this world, she had to be twice as smart, twice as prepared, and 10 times as determined just to stand a chance. It was in their first year of law school that she met William Hawkins. He was everything she wasn't. Born into wealth, with a family legacy in law, and a smooth-talking charm that made him instantly popular, William seemed to glide through the academic pressures without breaking a sweat. Camille, on the other hand, had to juggle part-time jobs, long commutes, and the constant weight of feeling like she didn't belong. She was always on edge, always aware of how much more she had to prove. They first clashed in the first semester over a legal theory class. Camille had prepared for weeks, digging through pages of case studies and books, determined to understand the complexities of contract law. The day of the final debate, she was exhausted but ready. As the class started, William took the floor with his usual swagger, delivering his arguments with flawless precision, his points wrapped in a polished presentation that made the professors nod in approval. Camille watched, her frustration mounting. It wasn't that he wasn't brilliant. It was that he had never had to fight for what he had, never had to sweat over the material like she had. When it was her turn, Camille felt the familiar nerves creep up, but she also felt something else, a rush of adrenaline. She threw herself into her arguments, not just with intellect, but with passion. She knew she could do this, she had to. Her words cut through the air, challenging the assumptions of the class, pushing back against the easy answers that William and the others offered. The professor, who had favored William's style for most of the semester, looked at Camille with a mix of surprise and admiration as she made her case. That moment marked the beginning of their rivalry. It wasn't just academic anymore, it became personal. After that debate, things between them shifted. They were no longer just classmates. They were competitors, each trying to outdo the other at every turn. Camille's nights became longer, her drive to succeed growing more intense. While William spent his weekends attending social events and networking with influential professors, Camille buried herself in books and legal briefs. Every time she saw him, flashing a grin, talking effortlessly with classmates, wearing that effortless confidence, it stung. There were moments of grudging respect between them, but they were rare. Camille often found herself second to William in the rankings, her name trailing his in almost every class. And yet, she never gave up. If anything, the rivalry drove her harder. Late nights at the library, early mornings working on case studies, Camille pushed herself to the brink, determined that one day she would prove she belonged in the same conversation as the Williams of the world. What she hadn't expected, though, was the way the competition would eventually break her. By their final year, Camille had secured a prestigious internship with a legal firm, but not the one she had wanted. William had taken that spot. The realization hit her hard. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she gave, she was still falling short. It wasn't just the jobs or the accolades. It was everything. Her pride had taken a blow, but she had always been able to bounce back. Now, standing before him as a grown woman with her own business and a life of her own, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, in this courtroom, history was repeating itself. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Camille stood before Judge William Hawkins, the weight of the past hanging between them like an invisible wall. She could feel his eyes on her, scrutinizing, searching for something more than just the woman before him. Camille had always been good at reading people, and there was something in the way Judge Hawkins looked at her that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the usual detached professionalism she had grown used to from judges. It was something deeper, something personal. She couldn't quite place it, but she could feel it pulling at the edges of her mind. Judge Hawkins, on the other hand, was struggling with a realization that seemed to be coming to him in waves. He had been going through the motions, reviewing her case file, assessing the fine she was supposed to pay for a minor traffic violation when the name Camille Johnson caught his eye. At first, it didn't register. But then, as he continued to look at her, as her presence in the courtroom seemed to grow stronger in his mind, memories from their past began to flood back. He remembered the late nights in law school, the heated debates, the sharp words exchanged in classrooms and corridors. Camille had been the one person who challenged him at every turn, who had never let him slide by just because of his family's wealth or his smooth charm. She had always been there, always present, always competing. Back then, it had been nothing more than the drive to be the best, to prove himself against her as much as against anyone else. But now in this courtroom, seeing her standing before him, it was impossible to ignore the truth. She had been more than a rival. She had been a force that had shaped his growth, whether he had acknowledged it or not. The recognition hit him like a punch in the stomach. Camille Johnson, the same name from those late-night study sessions, the debates they had over coffee in the library, the face he had once seen across the classroom, eyes locked in silent competition. The very woman who had been the one person who had pushed him harder than anyone else, who had demanded he be better, had now walked into his courtroom, a stranger yet not a stranger at all. A brief flicker of panic crossed his face as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had heard about the cases he was involved in, the ones where people came back into each other's lives in ways they never expected, but never had he thought that his own past would resurface in such a personal way. For a moment, his composure faltered and the usual ease with which he passed judgments slipped away. His mind raced, grappling with the years that had passed since he last saw Camille and the person she had become. Camille could see the change in his expression, the way his confident demeanor wavered for just a split second. She recognized it, though she didn't understand why. Was it guilt? Surprise? A flicker of something else? Whatever it was enough to make her pause. She had spent years pushing the past aside, building a life on her own terms, a life far removed from the constant shadow of rivalry she had once shared with William Hawkins. But now, standing before him, everything felt unsettled. The memories, the competition, the quiet resentment, all of it seemed to surge up again, as though she hadn't left those college halls behind at all. The moment stretched out longer than either of them anticipated. The silence grew heavier, and Camille felt a twinge of unease. She couldn't read him, not fully, and it frustrated her. She had been through so much in her life, faced obstacles that would have crushed anyone else, and yet, here she was, unsure of how to navigate this strange, unexpected confrontation. Judge Hawkins cleared his throat, his voice quieter than usual, his words tinged with a recognition that neither of them had anticipated. "Do you remember me, Miss Johnson?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of years of unspoken history. Camille froze for a moment, processing the question, the way it landed in the air between them like an echo from the past. And then it clicked. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Camille's heart skipped a beat. "Do you remember me, Miss Johnson?" The words echoed in her mind, but it wasn't just the question itself that unsettled her. It was the way Hawkins had said it, hesitant yet laced with something deeper, something unfamiliar. She searched his face, trying to find any hint of recognition, but he was careful to keep his expression neutral, his eyes guarded. It took her a moment, but the fog in her mind cleared, and then it hit her. The rivalry, the late nights, the way he always seemed to glide through life with everything handed to him. William Hawkins, the golden boy of law school, had been her fiercest competitor. She'd never forgotten the sharp, competitive edge he brought to everything, the smugness in his voice whenever he won a case or scored higher than her on an exam. He had been everything she'd strived to overcome, privileged, entitled, confident in a way that she had never been. But then the memory of the debates, of the moments when she had managed to beat him at his own game, came rushing back. There had been times when she had felt like the underdog, times when she was sure she would never get ahead of him, but she had fought, and in those small victories, she had carved out her place in a world that had tried to exclude her. She had been proud of those moments, even if they hadn't earned her the accolades others got. She had earned them on her own terms. "William Hawkins," Camille said, her voice calm, but laced with the recognition that finally settled in her chest. "I remember you now." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of surprise and uncertainty, as if he hadn't expected her to remember him so quickly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the room feeling like it had closed in around them. The judge's gavel, usually a symbol of power and control, seemed distant and almost irrelevant in that moment. The case before them was forgotten, the ticket, the fine, the usual protocols of the court, none of it mattered now. This was something else entirely. Camille took a deep breath, holding herself together as she met his gaze. "It's been a long time, hasn't it? Since law school." William's posture shifted, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him as if he was trying to regain his usual composure. But there was something in the way he looked at her now, something different. This wasn't the same man she had once sparred with in debates or fought to outshine in class. This man was older, more settled in his position, but she could still sense that same drive beneath the surface. She could feel it, just as she had all those years ago. "I didn't expect to see you here," William said, his voice low and careful. "In my courtroom of all places." Camille raised an eyebrow, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "I didn't expect it either, but life has a way of surprising you." He nodded, his eyes briefly flicking to the file in front of him, then back to her. "I remember you were always the one who kept me on my toes back then, Camille. You never backed down, always challenging me." Camille's heart thudded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. He remembered. After all these years, after all the changes, he remembered her. The thought was both satisfying and unsettling. She hadn't expected this moment to be one of recognition, but now that it was, she didn't know what to do with it. She had fought so hard to leave her past behind, to become more than the girl who had battled with William Hawkins for the top spot in their class. She had fought to become someone who stood on her own, someone who no longer needed to prove herself. And yet, here they were again, facing each other, just as they had all those years ago, each of them holding on to pieces of the past that neither had fully let go of. "You know," Camille said, her voice a little softer, "I never expected to be here facing you like this. But I'm not that same person anymore. I've worked hard to get to where I am, and I don't plan on letting anything or anyone stand in my way." William looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since the start of the hearing, something in his eyes softened. There was no trace of superiority, no trace of the rivalry that had once driven them. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, an understanding, perhaps, that what they had once fought for was no longer relevant. They had both come so far, in different ways, and the game they had played so fiercely in their youth was no longer the one they needed to win. "I see that," he said quietly. "I can see it in you." There was no challenge in his voice now, no competitive edge, just the quiet respect of two people who had spent years trying to prove something, only to realize that the thing they had needed to prove most was to themselves. The silence between Camille and William stretched longer than either of them anticipated. The usual buzz of the courtroom seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of their shared history hovering between them. Camille could feel the eyes of the gallery on her, but it wasn't their judgment she feared. It was the sudden realization that, despite all the time that had passed, their rivalry wasn't something that could easily be erased. William cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "I should focus on the matter at hand," he said, his voice returning to its usual authoritative tone. But the pause, the softening of his features, remained. He shuffled through the case files, though Camille could tell his thoughts were elsewhere. His fingers traced the edges of the paper absently, as though he wasn't quite sure how to proceed. Camille crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "You know, I wasn't expecting a reunion like this," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge. "I thought we had both moved on from that time." William didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lifted his eyes to meet hers, the intensity of their shared history clouding the space between them. The younger version of William Hawkins, the one she had fought against, was still there in his eyes, but there was something new, something more settled, as though time had tempered his previous arrogance. He wasn't the same man, but neither was she. "You've done well for yourself, Camille," he said after a long pause, his words surprising her. "I see it now. The woman you've become. It's impressive." Camille felt a flicker of discomfort at his compliment. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate it. It was that it was coming from him, the man who had always seemed to believe that the world owed him success. The man who had beaten her time and time again in ways that had left her feeling small. Yet here he was, acknowledging her in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she replied carefully, her mind racing. She wanted to tell him that it hadn't been easy, that she had fought for every inch of progress she had made, but the words didn't come out. Instead, she found herself staring down at the small piece of paper in front of her, the ticket that had led her into this courtroom in the first place. The fine, the infraction. In the grand scheme of her life, this was nothing, a mere blip. But today, standing before him, it felt like something more. William glanced at the ticket, then back at Camille. "I'm sorry about this situation," he said, his voice softer now. "I know this is a minor infraction, but it's still my job to enforce the law." Camille nodded, though she couldn't help but wonder if he truly understood. This wasn't just about a parking ticket or a traffic violation. This was about a moment when their worlds collided in a way neither of them had expected. It was about the past, the unspoken history they shared, and the unresolved tension that now hung in the air. As the words settled between them, Camille realized how much she had grown over the years. The person standing before William Hawkins was no longer the same girl who had struggled to find her place in a law school filled with people who never understood the weight she carried. She had found her own path, built her own success, And now, standing here in his courtroom, she was no longer fighting to be seen. She had already proven herself. William's gaze softened, as though he had come to the same conclusion. He knew the old competition between them didn't matter anymore. He knew she had long since surpassed that. What mattered now was respect. Respect for the woman Camille had become. "Look," William said finally, pushing the case file aside. "This fine. I can dismiss it. It's trivial, and I'm sure you've learned your lesson." Camille blinked, momentarily stunned. "You could do that." "I'm the judge here," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I can make exceptions." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. This wasn't a gesture born out of pity or charity. There was no condescension, only a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had both come. The years of rivalry, of striving to prove themselves, had led them to this moment, a moment of understanding. "I appreciate that, William," Camille said softly. She felt a surprising sense of relief wash over her. The tension that had built between them seemed to dissipate, replaced by something she hadn't expected: peace. For the first time in years, Camille realized that perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally let go of the rivalry that had defined so much of her journey. And for that, she was grateful. The gavel's sharp tap snapped Camille back to the present moment. The room suddenly filled with the familiar sounds of the courtroom once more. But the air had shifted, lighter, more open. There was still a deep history between her and William Hawkins, but it no longer felt like something they were bound to fight against. The realization had settled in, and neither of them seemed eager to revisit the old wounds. William cleared his throat, his voice now firm, yet laced with a warmth that Camille had never heard from him before. "This fine is dismissed," he declared, his tone carrying the weight of a decision. "Miss Johnson, your record is clean, and there's no reason to let this minor infraction weigh on you. I've seen enough." Camille nodded, the surprise still lingering within her. It wasn't so much the fact that he'd dismissed the fine, it was the way he had done it. It wasn't a transaction, a favor, or a political move. It felt like something deeper, an acknowledgement of the journey both of them had been on, a silent recognition of the roads they'd traveled and the battles they'd fought. "Thank you, Judge Hawkins," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I appreciate your decision." For a brief moment, the two of them simply stood there, exchanging no more than a quiet understanding. It was an odd feeling, one that neither had expected when Camille had first walked into the courtroom. There had been so much animosity, so many years of competition that had shaped both their careers and their identities. But now, with the fine gone, there was a sense of finality, a closing of a chapter neither had ever expected to revisit. As Camille turned to leave, she felt a shift in the dynamic between them. She wasn't just walking out of his courtroom. She was walking away from a past that, for so long, had held a part of her captive. That bitter rivalry, those late-night debates, the constant comparisons, it was over. William Hawkins wasn't her adversary anymore. He wasn't the person she had spent years trying to outrun or outsmart. They had both moved on, grown in different ways, and perhaps it was time to finally let go of the ghost that had kept them tied to the past. But just as she reached the door, she heard him speak her name. "Camille," he called softly. She paused, not turning around immediately. She could feel his eyes on her, and for a moment, she wondered if they were about to slip back into that old dynamic. But when she finally looked at him, she saw something new in his gaze, something she hadn't expected. "You know," William began, his voice a little hesitant, as if the words were coming from a place he hadn't visited in a long time. "Back in law school, I always thought you'd be the one to beat me. I mean, I knew it from the first time I saw you argue. You always pushed me to be better. And, well, I guess I never really said it, but I respect you for that." Camille was taken aback. This wasn't the William Hawkins she had known, the one who had always kept his superiority firmly in place, who had brushed off every accomplishment of hers with a grin and a comment. This was something else, something unexpected, even vulnerable. She stared at him for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to dismiss the sentiment, to remind him of how many times she had fought for acknowledgement from him and never received it. But then, in the quiet of the courtroom, she realized that wasn't what she wanted anymore. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let her ego dictate her next move. "Thank you, William," she said, her voice softer now. "That means more than you know." A long pause followed, and then he nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "Take care of yourself, Camille. You've got this." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her steps lighter than when she entered. It wasn't just the dismissal of the fine that had lifted the burden off her shoulders. It was the release of the rivalry, the acknowledgement that, after all these years, they had both moved past it. Camille had never imagined that her meeting with William Hawkins would end this way, on such a quiet, respectful note. But in that moment, she realized that it didn't matter how it had started. What mattered was how it ended. Outside the courthouse, Camille paused for a moment, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She had come here to fight a small, insignificant battle, but in the process, she had come to terms with something much bigger, the past. It was no longer something she had to outrun. It was something she could leave behind. And in that moment, she knew that she had truly moved on. The courthouse doors swung open as Camille stepped out into the bright afternoon light. For a moment, she stood there, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the outside world. The bustle of the city was a stark contrast to the quiet, tense atmosphere she had just left behind in the courtroom. The weight that had pressed down on her chest all morning seemed to have evaporated, replaced by an unexpected sense of freedom. She had walked into that courthouse with one goal, to get rid of a traffic fine. But she had walked out with something far more significant, a release. The rivalry, the past, the bitterness she had held onto for so long, it was all suddenly irrelevant. Her encounter with William Hawkins had forced her to confront a part of herself she had buried for years, and in doing so, she had freed herself from it. She felt lighter, like she could breathe again, unburdened by the weight of old grudges. As Camille made her way down the courthouse steps, she couldn't help but replay the conversation with William in her mind. His unexpected words of respect, the quiet recognition in his eyes, it had caught her off guard. She had spent so many years fighting for his acknowledgement, for some sort of validation, only to realize now that she didn't need it. What had been important in their rivalry back then no longer mattered. She had built her own life, her own career, and it was enough. Camille had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to navigate the world without relying on anyone else's approval. But even she couldn't deny the small part of her that had always longed for recognition from those who had once overshadowed her. William Hawkins had been that person, the one who seemed to effortlessly glide through life, the one who had always been a step ahead, even when she had been working twice as hard. And yet, here she was, walking away from him, not as a defeated rival, but as someone who had finally come into her own. The reality of that hit her as she reached the street and turned toward her car. She had done it. She had stepped into a courtroom, faced the ghosts of her past, and walked away victorious, not because she had defeated anyone, but because she had defeated the need to compete. As she slid into the driver's seat, she took a deep breath, letting the cool leather of the seat welcome her. The world outside seemed to fade for a moment as her thoughts turned inward. She thought of her career, the clients she had fought for, the legal battles she had won. Camille had built something she could be proud of, something she had achieved on her own terms. There was no need for anyone else to validate her. Yet, as the car rumbled to life, Camille couldn't help but smile to herself. She hadn't expected any of this, least of all, the sense of closure she had received today. For years, she had been driven by the desire to prove herself, to rise above the challenges, the doubts, and the competition. And now, in a strange twist of fate, she had come to realize that the only person she had ever needed to prove anything to was herself. As she merged onto the highway, Camille felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past was behind her, the rivalry with William Hawkins a distant memory. She had not only freed herself from the shadow of that competition, but had also found the strength to embrace who she had become. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she had been searching for all along, a feeling of completeness. The road ahead stretched out before her, wide and open. Camille didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she was no longer weighed down by the ghosts of her past. She was ready for whatever came next. Whatever came next, she would face it with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally, fully stepped into the light. Days passed since Camille's unexpected encounter with William Hawkins, but the feeling it had left behind lingered longer than she expected. Life had returned to its usual rhythm, with deadlines to meet, clients to advise, and cases to win. Yet something within her had shifted, a subtle but undeniable change. The past no longer felt like a weight on her shoulders. It was merely a part of the story that had led her to where she was today. It wasn't that she had forgotten William Hawkins or their rivalry. It was that it no longer mattered. She had spent so many years competing with him in her mind, striving to prove she was just as capable, just as worthy of success. Now, standing in her office late one evening, reviewing case files and preparing for the next challenge, she realized something profound. The validation she had always sought from others, especially him, had been unnecessary all along. She had built her success on her own terms, through hard work and dedication. And that, she thought, was enough. As Camille sat back in her chair, looking out over the city skyline, a soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find her assistant Jane standing in the doorway with a phone in hand. "There's someone on the line for you, Camille," Jane said, a smile playing on her lips. "It's Judge Hawkins." Camille blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, not after their brief but meaningful conversation in the courtroom. But there he was, reaching out. "Put him through, please," she said, her voice steady but curious. A moment later, William's voice came through the speaker, warm yet professional. "Miss Johnson, it's William. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Camille couldn't help but smile at his formality. "Not at all, Judge Hawkins. What can I do for you?" "I just wanted to thank you again for the conversation we had," he said. "I've been thinking a lot about it since we last spoke. It's not often that someone challenges my perspective the way you did. I guess I never realized how much that rivalry, that competition, had shaped both of us until now." Camille leaned back in her chair, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her desk. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's strange, isn't it? How the past can hold such a grip on you, even when you think you've let it go. But it's not about weighing anymore. It's about who we've become in the process." "Exactly," William agreed. There was a slight pause, as if he was considering his words carefully. "I don't think I ever truly acknowledged how much you pushed me to be better. I've learned a lot from you, Camille, more than you probably know." Her smile deepened at his sincerity. "Thank you, William. That means a lot. I think we both know now that the real victory wasn't in beating each other. It was in becoming the people we are today." There was another brief pause before William spoke again. "I agree. And I'd like to think that maybe, despite everything, we could work together on something someday. We've both come a long way, and there's a lot we could accomplish." Camille's heart skipped a beat. Work together. The thought had never crossed her mind, but now, hearing him say it, it felt like the natural next step. Perhaps there was a future where their paths didn't have to be defined by competition, but by collaboration. Two people who had once been rivals now united by mutual respect. "I think that's a great idea," Camille said, her voice filled with quiet excitement. "Let's see where it takes us." The conversation drifted toward other topics after that, and Camille found herself laughing at a joke William made about their shared experiences in law school. It was a different dynamic than the one they had once shared, a dynamic based on understanding, not competition. When they finally hung up, Camille felt something she hadn't expected: peace. The journey she had taken, the battle she had fought with herself and with William, had led her here, to this moment of growth and reconciliation. The rivalry that had once consumed her had been replaced with something far more valuable, a partnership born not of competition, but of mutual respect. As she sat back in her chair, Camille realized that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. There would be new challenges, new clients, new cases, and new relationships to navigate. But now she was ready for them, with a clarity she had never felt before. And as the city lights twinkled outside her window, Camille smiled to herself. She had come full circle, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. The woman she was today had emerged from the shadows of the past, and now she was ready to embrace the future. Whatever came next, she knew she could handle it, no longer alone, but with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones you win, but the ones you let go.